What Remains of Edith Finch is a video game that follows the last surviving member of the extremely unfortunate Finch family as she attempts to navigate a convoluted and complex family history she has never been previously allowed to observe. In-game, it's revealed the Finch family are a lot best known for their exceptionally poor luck, with the overwhelming majority of them perishing at a young age in typically deeply unusual circumstances. Their awful lot in life has led many to speculate the entire family is subject to a terrible curse, with Edith Jr. exploring if there is any validity to this claim by examining the various deaths that have defined the last 3 generations of her family. What the game ultimately reveals to the audience has led to mass theorizing, with people speculating everything from a factual, tangible curse to a murderous head matriarch, when in actuality, the curse is a little more akin to a terrible self-fulfilling prophecy that's passed down from generation to generation. So without further ado, let's more closely examine how this belief is forged and how it is passed down from member to member of the Finch household. One of the themes that's most prevalent in What Remains of Edith Finch is that while it's important to acknowledge the past, tethering yourself to it will lead to ruin. And this is an idea most effectively captured in Edie's father Odin, the first death in Edith Jr.'s family tree. We have almost no information on Odin as a character other than that he lived a life defined by tragedy, and was driven by said tragedy to the island the Finches came to inhabit, and that once there, died a tragic death. When we first learn about Odin, we learn that the incident that prompted him to move away to begin with was the premature death of his wife and infant son. And one would think that in the wake of a tragedy like this, it would be best to start over, to reconstruct yourself from the ground up. But instead, Odin is extremely insistent on rebuilding his life to be exactly the way that it once was, with him even going so far as to take his old house with him onto the ship. The ship then capsizes in a violent storm, and while Odin may still have died in the storm regardless, there is the question posed of, don't you think the ship would have had significantly better chances at surviving had it not been carrying an entire house? Don't you think Odin would have had a far easier time escaping had all the important passageways not been blocked off by a literal houseboat that he should have let go of when he had the opportunity to do so? This sole piece of information clearly informs us that Odin is an idealist that is completely incapable of relinquishing the past or any of the pain that accompanies it, and will cling steadfastly to both regardless of the danger that it puts him or his loved ones in. Ironically, this is a behavior his daughter Edie learns nothing from, and goes on to replicate for the rest of her life, setting into motion many of the events that we see in the story. With this context, Edith Sr. is almost instantly presented to us as someone that embodies the worst qualities of their father, while possessing unique traits of their own that amplify these harmful qualities to an extreme. Not only is Edie incapable of relinquishing her past or pain, but she is shown to be incapable of coping with either in their true forms. Because the reality is that more often than not, pain is banal. And yet the fact that it often is doesn't actually do anything to dull the extremes or permanence of it. Edith Sr., in response, copes with her most permanent, deep pains by marrying them with fantasy. A course of action she adopts after the accidental, tragic death of her first child that she finds herself unable to relinquish as time passes. Molly Finch's death is the first death that you play through in What Remains of Edith Finch, and on the surface level, it appears as though it's going to be one of the most fantastical, difficult to explain deaths that you encounter, with Molly being driven by a ravenous hunger after being sent to bed without supper. After eating everything there possibly is to eat in her room, she looks at the window, sees a bird, and, reaching out for it longingly, transforms into a cat. Molly then transforms from predator to predator, eventually transforming into a monster before suddenly turning back into a human girl, who can hear the monster that she previously was ravenous beneath her bed. And, knowing she will be eaten shortly, rapidly records her final moments. However, upon closer examination, it's heavily implied that Molly dies in one of the most ordinary ways a child can die, through consuming something that she shouldn't. When you play as Molly, you have been sent to bed without supper, and are so hungry that you are hell-bent on consuming every halfway edible object you have access to. These objects include an old, possibly moldy carrot in a gerbil bowl that visibly contains feces, an entire tube of toothpaste, which, given the fact the year is 1947, means the toothpaste likely has ingredients like soap and chalk in it, and decorative holly berries. It's debatable on whether or not these berries are real holly berries, because when you bite into them, there's an audible crunch that indicates they may be plastic. But real holly berries are poisonous, and while the amount that you eat that night isn't enough to kill you in of itself, that, in combination with the other things that you've eaten, can create a pretty serious reaction. Interestingly, none of the things that Molly eats would have caused her to hallucinate the experiences that she recorded in her journal as vividly as she did, but pain and fever can make people delirious as well. Every animal that we see recorded in the journal also appears in Molly's room as a stuffed animal, and she's established from the get-go to us as a highly imaginative young girl. So it's not tough to imagine that she'd cling to those images in a time of need. And while poisoning is a stretch too far for many of the experiences that Molly has in the journal seem to allude to her choking on her own vomit, further prompting the theory that the diary that we see in Molly's room is actually Edie's handwriting, perfectly aligning with what Edie does best. Unable to cope with her daughter's preventable death, she fabricates a fantastical story of her final night, It's perfectly understandable why Edie would gravitate towards this as a coping mechanism, given how her punishment is the thing that ultimately led to her daughter's untimely demise. Could you imagine the sheer guilt? Even though it's considered almost cruel now, sending your child to bed without supper after misbehaving was a common punishment in the 1940s, and never one a parent would give with a reasonable expectation something harmful would befall their child in the event they did so. While morbid, the only way in which Edie can cope with the knowledge that her youngest child died feeling dejected and hungry is by spinning her final moments into a magical adventure to soften the blow. And while though we can understand this need when it comes to Molly, the course of action she takes with Barbara shifts the story into significantly more sinister territory. Barbara's death is difficult to rationalize because of all the Finch deaths that we encounter. Hers actually has the least amount of clues as to what happened. However, there are a few things we can definitively conclude about her death. That she died suddenly, presumably violently, and deeply afraid. And while though it's debatable on whether or not her younger brother Walter saw what happened, he most definitely heard it. You see hints of this as you explore the house in the modern day, as the banister does show obvious signs of disrepair, which seem to imply a struggle of some sort once happened there, as people don't usually just casually go careening through them. Additionally, in each Finch memorial, Edith Sr. incorporates the things that she views as being most relevant in each Finch's death, which is morbid, but it's especially interesting that she chose to incorporate a crutch into both Barbara's portrait and memorial. Edith Jr. also draws Barbara with a crutch, wielding it in a defensive position as though she's attempting to ward someone off. So a struggle of some kind is definitely implicated here. The question just is, which kind? In the comic that you play through of Barbara's death, she has to use the crutch to fend off against the Hookman, a Michael Myers-inspired character to fit with the whole campy slasher theme. The likelihood of this infamous, extremely stylized serial killer actually being the one that killed Barbara is unlikely in my eyes, but the comic also provides two possible alternatives that may seem more probable. The first being there are a group of home invaders that have been terrorizing the island in Halloween masks, which explains the monsters Walter may have seen kill his sister. However, there's also the argument that the killer is Barbara's boyfriend, as prior to this, the two had gotten into an argument in which Barbara wound up slapping him and telling him to leave the house. As for which would have an easier time gaining access to the house, I think either is equally possible, given the fact the house is already poorly secured and that Barbara's boyfriend already has a good idea of the layout. There is ample evidence for either committing the crime. On the one hand, Barbara dies in an incredibly violent fashion that implies numerous people were involved, with her literally being torn to shreds. But on the other, her ear is stashed in a location that is borderline impossible to access if you don't know how to. And the only person we see also learn how to access it is her boyfriend. Her boyfriend needs crutches to get around, but is highly athletic, prompting the possibility that Barbara may have snatched a crutch out from underneath him to better defend herself in the event that he got violent with her. Yet in the event that Barbara died in a home invasion, her death, like that of her sisters, is indirectly due to Edie's neglect. In the event it was home invaders, we see Sven and Edie leave Barbara home alone while knowing the island is currently being ravaged, a fact that makes Edie's deliberate ambiguity when discussing the nature of Barbara's death all the more chilling, as this ambiguity is precisely the thing that makes it easy to sensationalize, allowing her to profit off a death she indirectly caused. While Molly's death is a pure accident, although still a preventable one, Barbara's is the product of direct neglect. And while I'm not under the impression that Edie made the deliberate choice to leave with the knowledge that her daughter would be killed in the event that she did, her cavalier attitude resulted in yet another daughter's death. But instead of coping by crafting the short, personal story she did with Molly, Edie goes so far as to make a public spectacle of her oldest's terrifying passing. In doing so, Edie subconsciously plants the seed in the minds of her three remaining sons that death, and specifically their deaths, are impending and inevitable. If Molly and Barbara fell victim to a centuries-long curse, then what's to say they won't as well? It's a line of thought that causes twins Calvin and Sam to grow passive towards the notion of their deaths in a manner that makes the two act in a dangerously negligent fashion, Calvin especially. Between the two, Calvin is established as the adventurous risk-taker, the child that constantly gets themselves into various scrapes and scraps, and boasts a wide range of injuries acquired in unusual ways. After attending Barbara's funeral, and likely partially bearing witness to the way that she died, screaming, Calvin and Sam pledge to themselves that they will never be afraid of anything ever again. Somewhat ironically, Calvin winds up with what I consider to be the most terrifying death in Edith Finch, because as soon as you see the swing, as soon as you see the cliff, you know exactly where the story is going to go. And yet there is nothing that you, the player, can do to stop this. There's also this heartbreaking innocence attached to Calvin's death in that he is just a young boy with a hunger for thrill, for adventure, for anything that had reaffirmed to him that he is alive after being surrounded by death for the past few years. To Calvin, he is functionally immortal, incapable of seeing danger even when directly passing over it because he is a child. And no child does anything with the assumption they're going to die. And there's a point where he passes the point of no return, where the music swells and we as the audience must watch as the adrenaline and euphoria shifts into terror. Even more disturbingly, the letter we read that describes this tragedy as the fulfillment of Calvin's wish to fly isn't from Edie. It's from his twin, Sam, who has seemingly taken on his mother's style of coping. However, of all the preventable deaths we witness throughout the game, Walter's death is easily the most preventable, showcasing Edie at her absolute worst and revealing just how far she was willing to exploit her own family to sustain the narrative of a Finch curse. When you play through Walter's story, it shows that after being traumatized by his sister Barbara's murder, he moves into the basement. He becomes a recluse, convinced the curse is real and out to get him, and that the only way to sustain his life is to barricade himself in a small, secluded space. Should he leave, he'd suffer the same fate as his sisters, both who'd been rumored to be killed by monsters. Although the exact age Walter enters the basement is debatable, some believe it's 8, others believe it's 16, based on the dates on the calendar, either way he enters it when he's still a child. And when a child has a paranoid delusion that's isolating them, that's hurting them, it's the responsibility of the parent to prevent it from progressing. And Edie ultimately does not do that, because to acknowledge that her daughters weren't killed by monsters is to acknowledge that she played a partial role in their deaths. And that's something that Edie cannot handle. In order to protect herself from the guilt that's surrounding her children's deaths, Edie not only needs to believe in the curse herself, but she also needs Walter to believe in it. So rather than bring a terrified, deeply traumatized boy back to reality, she actively feeds into his delusions. Edie is the one that brings him the supplies that are necessary for him to sustain himself in the basement. Edie is the one that never bothers to clarify the true nature of both of her daughters' deaths, which is something that she, as their mother, would naturally know. Edie is the one that fails to clarify the biggest piece of evidence Walter uses to justify him staying in the basement, that there isn't a monster clawing at and rattling at the walls, but a train running around their house. She even begins to outright profit off her son's suffering, giving exclusive interviews about the mole man living beneath her home, and was perfectly content to let him rot there for 30 years so long as it sustained the narrative that she needed to protect herself. When it comes to Walter's death, one of the things that I commonly see people criticize is the fact that Walter breaks through the walls of the basement with a sledgehammer instead of just going up the stairs. But I think you can rationalize that when you take into consideration the fact that Walter explicitly doesn't want to see his mother again. He's presumably gained at least a crude awareness that something is off about the narrative that she's been feeding him and wants to leave without anybody noticing. Unfortunately, he just happens to be struck down the moment that he fulfills that desire. With that, we have the death of 4 of the 5 members of the first generation of Finches, a trend that typically repeats itself with each successive generation, with every child dying with the exception of one, the sole survivor being the one that then bears children and continues the Finch legacy. The second generation, consisting exclusively of Sam's children, gives us further insight into how this pattern works, with the first death typically being a true accident, and the successive ones being the product of grief-fueled negligence. After Walter's death comes Gregory's, Sam's youngest son, and the death that sets into motion all of the deaths that precede it in the second generation. Gregory's story is widely considered to be the most difficult to play through, likely due to the fact that it strikes so close to home. Very few people know people that have flung themselves off the side of cliffs or been struck by trains, but almost everybody knows a person that experienced an extremely close call with their baby, whether that was them almost forgetting to take them out of the car or forgetting to put a pool cover on. Gregory's death, him drowning in the bathtub after accidentally turning the tap back on, taps into what is one of the most notoriously prevalent nightmare scenarios parents find themselves faced with. It taps into the same fear Pet Sematary does, that even a momentary lapse of judgment could potentially cost you everything. It's an incredibly preventable death, but we see deaths that resemble it all the time. Parents experiencing a moment of carelessness that cost their child their life. The juxtaposition that exists between this knowledge and the gameplay of this segment is so intense, because while you, as the player, are excruciatingly aware of the fact that you are in danger and powerless to protect yourself against it, Gregory, the character that you're playing, is so innocently unaware of it all. The music that plays in this segment is a waltz that has this whimsical, almost magical feel to it. The colors are more bright and bubbly in this segment than in any other, and there's the additional magic of having your toys come to life. And yet, all while this is happening, the tub is slowly filling, and you are blissfully unaware of the fact that death is approaching up until the moment that it happens, which is something made so much sadder by the reality this is most likely what Gregory's death looked like. The contents of the letter that allows us to see Gregory's death is Sam's final attempt to assure the grieving mother of his children that Gregory's death was not her fault. And there's something that's so devastating about Sam specifically, who's established to be like Dawn in that he rejects the concept of a Finch curse in adulthood and turns over towards hard logic and reasoning to rationalize the events that his family experiences, trying to create something almost comforting out of something so genuinely awful, because that is the only way in which he knows how to process death. And yet at the same time, I struggle to think of anything more profoundly disturbing than attempting to romanticize the death of your infant, regardless of whether or not it's merely to cope. Sam, blinded by the grief of having lost his wife and infant son in one fell swoop, rushes to remarry at the first possible opportunity, a decision that deeply upsets and angers his oldest son, Gus, who obviously hasn't fully recovered from the loss of either. Ironically, In attempting to construct a lifestyle he thinks will theoretically benefit his children, he completely neglects their needs in the present moment, a choice that leads to the death of his other son. Gus is such a sympathetic character because he is overlooked in life to the point that it directly leads to his death, and even in death, is overlooked in favor of his more unique, memorable family members. He is often brushed off as simply a defiant, angsty teenager that is rebellious for the sake of rebellion. People often push children's pain aside, but I feel this phenomena is worse for children like Gus that are right there on the cusp of young adolescence. As soon as they're around the age of 12 or 13, any intense emotion they experience is treated as the result of hormones or puberty, and is dismissed as such. Children that are this age are so often treated as though they lack the intelligence to identify the emotions they are currently experiencing. And Gus is no different. His family has already been altered in a permanent way that he's clearly having a hard time coming to full terms with. His infant brother is dead, and with his death his mother has left him, which is already like a tragic loss in of itself, worsened by the fact that every night he still has to sleep next to the crib. He voices his displeasure about his father's remarrying multiple times, stating that he's not ready, that he doesn't want this, that he would actually rather die than watch this happen. And yet instead of taking the time to address this very real, valid struggle, his family simply forces yet another change into Gus's life, directly sending the message that his needs are not a priority, and there's no point in attempting to communicate them if this is going to be the response. He isolates himself afterwards, feeling angry, bitter, and jaded, and even still, his anger is trivialized by the adults that are around him. They brush this all off as something he'll tire himself out from. They simply just set him out to simmer while the wedding party rages on so they can all have a good time. And they all collectively forget about the fact that he exists for a few hours. In order to do this, even when there is thunder and lightning, nobody takes the time to recall the fact there is a child flying a kite a few hundred feet away. Nobody takes inventory. Nobody notices the fact that somebody is missing. And Dawn, Gus's sister, even says it herself, that she didn't even think of Gus until they found his body. A horribly sad way to go, given the fact the entire reason Gus isolates himself to begin with is because he feels unheard and unnoticed, and he dies a death that essentially affirms that fact. Much in the way that Edith Sr. lost 2 daughters due to neglect and then 2 sons due to the trauma response that loss provoked, Sam loses 2 sons, one due to neglect and one due to unaddressed pain. Yet instead of learning from these mistakes so he can provide adequate support for his last surviving child, Sam only spirals further. What is saddest about Sam is that despite living his life attempting to avoid the fate that befalls his brother, he suffers essentially the same one, with the 2 accidentally falling off from cliffs. Between him and his brother, Calvin is the one that's established as the dreamer, the risk-taker, the daredevil, with there even being this image of Icarus associated with him, although it's actually never confirmed whether or not Calvin even believes in the concept of a Finch curse. What we do know is that his sister's premature deaths burn the belief that if death is truly impending, there's no point in living life with any inhibition into his psyche. He lives his life wildly and recklessly and seemingly enjoys every moment of it, even when his adventures come at a personal expense. When we play as Calvin, we see he already has a shattered leg due to the fact that he's likely attempted similar stunts in the past, and while it's somewhat implied that Sam was always the more cautious of the 2, Calvin's death further hones in the idea that living a disciplined, pragmatic, grounded life will be, in of itself, enough to mitigate tragedy. Sam has this idea that if you directly confront death, you can steel yourself against it, and he appears to seemingly take comfort in confronting it, with him immediately enlisting in the US Marines at 18, later taking up hunting as a hobby after. He's obsessed with the practical ways in which people can prevent their own deaths, with the actions that he takes with his own children being direct reflections of his own trauma. For instance, his insistence that Dawn learned to shoot despite her not wanting to because of what happened with her sister Barbara. However, the irony is that all of Sam's children and Sam himself die in freak accidents caused by momentary lapses of judgment, in contrast to Sam's siblings being driven by prolonged neglect. But while brief, these moments are enough to cause tragedy. Sam's death, like that of his children, is caused by a blind lapse of judgment, with Sam ultimately meeting his brother's end despite living a life designed to avoid it. This leaves Dawn the sole survivor of the 2nd generation of Finches, and unlike her predecessors, Dawn clearly understands the danger the Finches' approach to death and tragedy as something inevitable, impending, and unpreventable poses, with her taking the steps in adulthood to distance herself as much as possible, even going so far as to move to another continent. The only reason she returns at all is out of absolute necessity, with her husband Sanjay passing away in a freak accident and leaving her with 3 young children to care for on her own. However, the Finch household isn't exactly the best place to properly evade tragedy, and it doesn't take long for it to find her grieving children, with her middle child, Milton, disappearing without a trace. When it comes to discussing Milton's disappearance, there are 2 ways in which you can approach the topic. If you want to go for a realistic approach, it's heavily theorized that Milton wound up entering and getting trapped in one of the hidden passageways around the house. It would explain why he perceives them to be magic, because they seemingly appear out of nowhere. And it also explains why Dawn will be so insistent on sealing up every room in the house after his disappearance. Now, the counter-argument to this is that if Milton did indeed wind up getting trapped within the walls, There would have been at least a smell or something to indicate to his family that he was there, something they couldn't ignore. And while this is a valid argument, what I find interesting is that while Edith Jr. claims that her mother never stopped searching for Milton, Dawn explicitly states in an argument that she knows that her son is dead and that she blames Edith Sr. for that fact. So I think it can be safely assumed that Dawn knows something that she never divulges to the rest of her family. The creators of What Remains of Edith Finch have gone out of their way to confirm that Milton was, in fact, whisked away to another world, a world that we see in a previous game entitled The Unfinished Swan. In it, you play an orphaned boy whose only remnant of his mother is an unfinished swan painting. One day, the swan painting comes to life, and as you pursue it, you stumble across a fantastical painted world. Milton Finch is the creator and ruler of that world, and appears as a character exclusively referred to as the king. While I haven't played The Unfinished Swan yet, based off of what I've read about the story, I think it can be safely assumed that Milton becomes so obsessed with the world of his own making that he is eventually consumed by it. There's even a line that alludes to this happening by stating that Milton was consumed by the house. Although Edith Jr. begins her journey clinging to the hope that her brother may still be alive, she relinquishes this hope the moment that she fully explores his room with her, going so far as to assign him a death date in her journal, suggesting that regardless of whether or not you choose to view his disappearance in a realistic way or in context of the magical experiences the story provides, he does cease to exist in some form. Milton isn't the only child of Dawn that retreats so deeply into their fantasies they cease to exist, with her oldest, Lewis, falling victim to a similar fate. After becoming addicted to an unspecified substance and being forced to get clean, Lewis finds sobriety to be droll and monotonous, and copes with his pain by delving as deeply into his daydreams as he possibly can, to the extent that he takes his life to avoid having to exist in the reality that he inhabits. Lewis's daydream actually contains quite a few parallels to the fantasy worlds his brother Milton used to create for himself prior to his disappearance. Milton is depicted in almost every appearance he has as wearing the same crown, and in the other game that he appears in, he's referred to exclusively as the king. In The Unfinished Swan, you actually get to closely examine and explore the fantasy world that Milton created for himself, and if you do, you find it's actually strikingly similar to what Lewis was imagining. For Lewis's fantasies to be partially based off his brother's work is devastating, but makes sense, especially when taking into consideration the fact that Milton's disappearance was the event that kicked off the darkest period of Lewis's life. Milton's room even contains a toy set that is startlingly similar to the kingdom that Lewis builds. However, whereas Milton mainly paints in black and white, Lewis's kingdom is filled with flashy, vibrant color, and is also filled with a lot of imagery we associate with uninhibited freedom. The last part of the daydream that sticks out to me is that he's advised by a wise old calico, which I think can be taken one of two ways. Firstly, it's a direct reference to the cat that he and Edith Jr. had in childhood, which is also a reference to Molly Finch. Or it could be that the calico is Edie Finch, as calico can be used as slang to refer to an older woman, mainly older women that wear very brightly patterned clothing. If the calico is Edie, its behavior aligns perfectly with the behavior that we would expect from her had she known about Lewis's daydreams, with her encouraging him to delve fully into fantasy and completely disconnect from reality, regardless of the consequences that may have. When it comes to the deaths the third generation of Finches experience, Edie's influence cannot be remotely understated, as Edie is the one that delights in the notion of being consumed by the fantastical. It's precisely the mindset that has allowed her to survive loss upon loss while evading taking any responsibility for her role in them, and the one that has somewhat ironically compounded the tragedies that the Finches experience. We see time and time again the many ways in which each death is intertwined with another, and yet as this all is actively happening, Edie doesn't encourage or partake in any form of healthy or productive grieving. If only the cycle of grief could be addressed in a grounded, open manner, then perhaps the next generation of Finches could mend their relationships with tragedy and death, and learn how to healthily approach both instead of surrendering any personal agency. Although the two main matriarchs of the Finch household, Edie and Dawn, have completely different coping mechanisms and styles of grieving, they both contribute to the tragedy that is the Finch household. Edie copes with death by making a grand spectacle of it, coping with the premature loss of her loved ones by distorting their deaths into these incredible, almost whimsical narratives. Whereas Dawn attempts to avoid all memories of the tragedy once it occurs, with her sealing off anything that could potentially conjure one up. However, in doing these things, Dawn and Edie make the curse their family experiences a self-fulfilling prophecy. While there is importance to memorializing the dead, Edie does so in a way that anchors her family to the tragedies they experience. She turns their rooms into untouched shrines, but prevents the people that also cohabited those spaces from leaving. And the best example of this can be found in the twins Sam and Calvin's bedroom. On the door, there's a mural of both as young boys that's intended to be used as a height chart. Up until Calvin dies, him and Sam's heights are the same, and then after he passes, Sam has to confront the reality that he is growing to his true potential in a way his brother will never be able to. An already tragic scenario made worse by the fact that Sam partially blames himself for his brother's death. And yet although we can only assume that having to confront and fixate on that reality every day was extremely detrimental, Sam doesn't move out of this room until he becomes a grown adult. The other big thing about Edie is that rather than allow her family to sit and process the suffering they've endured, she encourages them to completely detach from reality, a coping mechanism that indirectly leads to the deaths of Dawn's children. Dawn also, despite her best efforts, indirectly contributes to this, with her refusal to discuss the dead creating a mysterious allure around them that, when partnered with Edie's fantastical tales, creates a recipe for disaster. And yet, although both have such radically different approaches to the two things that have most heavily defined their family, at the end of both of their lives, they share a similar fate, both dying alienated from their own immense pain. Edith Jr. is unique in that she's the first person to find a healthy medium between these two styles. She doesn't pretend the dead never existed, but she doesn't fixate on them either. She records the stories the way they're presented to her, but takes care to memorialize the people within them as the people they were. When we first meet Edith Jr., we can see that with Dawn's refusal to discuss any aspect of their family history whatsoever, she's aligned herself automatically more with Edie. There is this mysterious allure to the house. Everything is shrouded in secrets, and the possibilities themselves seem endless. However, Dawn provides Edith Jr. the unique gift of being able to discover her family history straight from the source, right from the perspectives of the people that existed within it and those that loved them best, rather than allowing Edith Jr. to be swayed by a captivating distortion of who her family members were and the lives they lived. When Edith Jr. explores the house for the first time and finally begins confronting the fables that her grandmother spun, we can see her slowly come to proper terms with the reality of what happened. Though she never voices any of these thoughts aloud, she tries her best to record the stories as they are presented to her. Although some are clearly exaggerations or distortions of the truth, due to the fact there's no one left alive that can properly confirm what happened or what didn't, she tries her best to make do with the little that she does have. And when logic does fail, she tries her best to record and remember the people that once were in the most human manner possible. Calvin is a thrill-seeking, adventurous daredevil, strapped into the spacesuit helmet he wore as a young boy. Molly is an imaginative little girl playing dress-up in her kitty cat ears. Greg is a bubbly, happy baby boy, and so on. Although Edith Jr. is never able to find any form of concrete answer, by the end of the game and the end of her life, she's ultimately able to provide her son a fleshed-out history of the people that came before him, and the brief but remarkable lives they led, encouraging him to live a life free of the pain that's been transmitted from generation to generation, and to define his destiny on his own terms, encouraging a neutral approach to both life and death and putting a definitive end to the Finch curse once and for all. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. And here's an extra special thank you to our Patreons. What we do would not be possible without your support. If you would like to count yourself among them, the link is in the description. Thank you all so much for your time, and have a fabulous day.